have the feeling that the world is full of disasters, calamities, catastrophes? Well, so did our ancient ancestors. From wars to earthquakes, floods to famines, this series will reveal how scientists are now unearthing the evidence for cataclysmic events in the past and their disastrous consequences. Fabulous cities abandoned.
The city dies.
The people here are meant to stay here forever, but something went wrong.
Battlefields long forgotten.
This onslaught of warriors hopping ashore and just causing mayhem and havoc.
We don't have any other archaeological site where we see a conflict of this dimension in that period.
Sophisticated civilizations toppled and lost to the mists of time.
I think it's up there with the modern tsunamis you see hitting the news today.
To our ancient ancestors suffering these catastrophes, it must have seemed as though they were cursed. But science is now exploding those myths and rewriting history. In this episode, the rise of the Roman Empire, one of history's greatest civilizations.
At that point, Rome was really the only force to reckon with.
Experts researching in far-flung reaches of the empire investigate newly discovered battlegrounds, finding out how Rome defeated her enemies and suppressed stubborn resistance, transforming her from a small city-state into one of the world's first superpowers. The Roman Empire was one of history's greatest and most influential civilizations. What started as a small settlement on the west coast of Italy developed into a vast empire stretching from Britain to Egypt and embracing the entire Mediterranean region. But while Rome herself enjoyed the riches of empire, many of the civilizations that opposed her expansion were cursed with warfare and destruction. So what was the secret to Rome's success? Rising above the landscape of the Scottish lowlands is a massive Iron Age hill fort that has intrigued archaeologists for years. Investigating what happened here on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire is Dr. John Reed.
It would have been occupied probably for 800 to 1,000 years before the Romans came here. People lived in roundhouses. These are major structures, 10 metres in diameter, and some of them 2-storey high. These would have constituted what was a town on top of this hill, maybe with 2,000 or 3,000 people living on the summit.
What happened to these people? Either side of the hill fort are two large, intriguing structures that offer a clue.
It's surrounded by two Roman siege works. One on the south here of 10 acres and one on the north side of the hill of 5 acres. There's no other arrangement like this in Britain at all, where you have Roman camps on either side of a hill fort very closely applied. In front of this one are these 3 amazing ballista platforms. These are unique in Britain.
The ballista was a siege weapon used in Roman warfare. But what were they doing here? Experts have long believed that this whole site was simply a Roman training camp. But John doesn't agree.
The area is completely covered, saturated in Roman ballistic material. Stone ballista balls, lead sling bullets, and iron arrowheads. Lead is pretty well indestructible in the soil over 2 millennia. So we were able to find these, locate these by metal detection.
They found 700 lead bullets, ballista shot, and a bolt head, the largest single haul from any Roman site, and the key to unravelling the mystery of what happened to the people here.
Like any crime scene, the ballistics really don't lie. Our method was to effectively look at the distribution of the ammunition, where the missiles had fallen, and then work back from the direction that these missiles had taken to work out where the shooters were standing and what their likely intent was.
A picture began to emerge of what really happened at Burnswalk Hill, and it wasn't target practice.
It's highly unlikely that you have a shooting gallery that's almost 3/4 of a kilometre long, and it's much more likely that this is the scene of an actual barrage because of the distribution of the missiles lie in such a way that they have all the hallmarks of warfare.
Rather than a training camp, John believes this is the site of a brutal siege dating from 140 CE, when we know the Emperor Antoninus Pius invaded Scotland.
The first thing that happens is that you have a missile barrage, and these black arrows and purple arrows represent them. What happens then is that the Roman infantry are free to assault from the south, so they come up here in the north camp, they stay put, they act as the blockading camp.
On the saddle of the hill, the Roman soldiers turned and faced the defenders head-on.
You can see at this point, something happens here. There's a collection of missiles to the north, and these missiles are an isolated clump. What this represents, effectively, is an attempted escape by some of the people who were crowded on the summit. What they're met with, effectively, is yet another blizzard of these lead sling bullets in this area. So some bad fate met these people at this point.
The Romans showed no mercy and deployed their weapons of terror, artillery. To find out just how destructive these weapons were, John has teamed up with ancient weapons expert Rob Longworth.
This is a 3-span bolt shooter. It's a baby of the ballista range. The Romans would use these devices much larger on this very platform we're standing on. Most units would have one of these devices.
Are they shooting stones? Or
yeah,
are
there's
they
stones coming from here, there's bolts coming from here, there's slings, slinging lead bullets up the hill. It's a barrage of devastation on the locals up that side.
The bolts themselves, can you let us see the bolt
sure.
again?
So the bolt, a wooden shaft with simple feathering at this end here to give it direction and stability, and a lethal armour-piercing tip, iron tip here. These are going to take out an arm, these are going to go through armour, these are going to go through a shield. These are devastating bits of equipment.
This target is 50 metres from the replica ballista.
Look at that!
But the actual bolts used in this attack were powerful enough to reach the fort 150 metres away.
Gee whiz. Can you imagine, though, the actual power behind one of the original weapons? This is incredible. That is just fantastic, and it's gone right through.
Yep,
Right
through the foam, through the wood.
Through the wood. I wouldn't like to be on the receiving end of one of those.
Trapped inside their hill fort, the defenders were unable to match the Romans' long-range capability.
When you get this degree of missile activity, what you're looking at here is not an assault and then a surrender. This is effectively a rout. This is a slaughter where the people on the summit are effectively doomed by this whole process. And the end result will be the ultimate loss of all life on the summit. This is overwhelming force.
The annihilation of the people of Burnswalk was a stark warning. Resist the might of Rome and suffer the consequences. and it was through this overwhelming force that the Roman Empire grew. Coming up, a brutal battle between Romans and barbarians.
They had packed up, wrapped up all their stuff. Nothing was ready to use, and then came a guerrilla-like attack.
How did a band of savages undermine centuries of Roman conquest? In the 9th year of the 1st century CE, the Emperor Augustus sent 3 legions into Germania to impose the will of Rome there. It was a region that he believed to have been pacified and that any local dissent would be easily crushed by his disciplined, battle-hardened and well-equipped troops. However, what was expected to be a straightforward mission was anything but. Northern Germany. Here, in these forests, a battle took place that tested the limits of Rome's military might. But for more than 1,000 years, the site of this battle has been lost.
The Roman grasp of German geography was not particularly great. They are aware of where the great rivers of Germany are, they're aware of where their forts were positioned, but beyond that, things start to get a little bit hazy.
But then, a chance find in 1987 led archaeologists to begin excavating on a site near Kalkriese in northern Germany.
We have discovered more than 6,000 Roman finds, and it's actually a whole range of objects. The majority that are Roman coins, silver and golden coins.
The coins all date from the time of the conflict, and when archaeologists unearthed Roman military equipment, they realised they had found the lost battle of Teutoburg Forest and could finally answer the question: how was an elite Roman force of 18,000 battle-hardened legionaries wiped out? 2,000 years ago, under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, 3 Roman legions left Germania for their winter camp on the Rhine, no doubt expecting an easy march. But there was a traitor in their midst: Arminius.
He's from Germanic royalty, he's from the royal family of the Cherusci tribe as far as we can see, but like a lot of Germans, has become Philo-Roman. He served in the army.
Arminius and his allies persuaded Varus to change the normal route back to the winter camp, a detour that would prove fatal.
They effectively say to Varus, the governor, look, we've heard that there is trouble further away. Let us go, we will get our friends to come and join you, and we will go and sort out this trouble together. And of course, instead of that, what they're doing is preparing an ambush.
Varus's legions marched through these forests, unfamiliar terrain, unaware of the danger closing in all around them.
They did not expect any military action. They had packed up, wrapped up all their stuff. Nothing was ready to use, and then came a guerrilla-like attack.
Arminius, of course, had served with the Roman army, so he had an insider's view of it in some ways. And I think he realised that set-piece battles were probably not the way forward, that the way forward was to launch an ambush, attack these people when they were weak and he was strong.
The Roman army fell apart. Within a matter of days, their commander, Varus, committed suicide, along with most of the senior officers. Now severely weakened, the remaining troops were lured into a final pitched battle. It was a slaughter and one of the worst defeats in Roman history.
This defeat of the Romans must have been for a Germanic warrior quite a triumph. They had defeated, let's say, the superpower of antiquity.
3 legions are destroyed. There are only 28 legions across the empire. So more than 10% of the legionary strength of the Roman Empire is lost in one fell swoop.
Rome, with her glittering military triumphs, with her enemies paraded in chains, was not used to defeat. A traumatised Caesar Augustus struck the 3 legions from the military rolls forever. And in 2020, archaeologists unearthed an incredible object that cast new light on the legions that fell in Germania.
The find of a Roman armor, a lorica segmentata, we call that a very special piece of Roman military equipment, fairly unique. Our armor is almost complete, and the whole situation shows that it was used during the battle and that something must have happened with it after the battle.
The armour has been undergoing months of painstaking restoration at Calcresa Museum.
This is one of the plates of our newly found Roman plate armour. When I excavated it from the soil, it was quite corroded, obviously, because it's iron, and also broken in several pieces.
The rare and fragile object is a cuirass, a piece of armour that protected a soldier's torso.
This piece is already fully conserved. This is the topmost back plate, which sits at the top of the back, near the neck.
Known as Lorica segmentata, it's the oldest example ever found and demonstrates that it was used by the Roman army much earlier than previously thought.
The theory was that generally at this time in Calcresa, the armor plates were a bit rudimentary and like a very early prototype of the later plate armor. But the newly found armor that we have here actually is already pretty sophisticated. So the armor making is more developed than we originally thought.
But how effective was this armour in battle? Archaeological reconstructor John Conyard has made an accurate replica of this type of armour.
A lorica segmentata really just means a segmented armour. It's made up of these iron sheets that have been fastened together by an arrangement of leather straps to give it some flexibility.
Increased flexibility meant that a soldier could move and use his weapons more freely.
It's not an easy armour to put on. You certainly couldn't put it on yourself. The Romans may have operated a buddy system where you would have a friend who would help put your armour on, and then you would swap over and help put his armour on. There is a buckle arrangement at the front to fasten the breastplate, and there's just a simple series of laces down the front that the legionary could probably do himself. On the Calcresi armour, this was a series of buckles.
This segmented armour is lighter and more flexible than earlier chain armour. But how protective was it?
The Calcresi segmentata was up to 3 millimetres thick and doesn't seem to have any shoulder plates. The way the plates overlap means the force of the blow will be spread over more than one plate, and if one part of the armour is damaged, it's relatively easy to take out and replace. Of course, the armour does primarily just defend the body. And being even 3 millimetres thick does not mean that it can stop a blow from some weapons, especially spears. So the Romans are relying on a shield-armour combination, not just on the armour itself to stop a blow.
This armour, worn by a forgotten Roman soldier, is stark evidence of the people who refused to become subjects of Rome. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest shook the Roman Empire and changed the course of history. Rome gave up on its ambitions for conquest east of the Rhine. But the northern European tribes wouldn't forget and would remain bitter enemies of Rome until its final days. Coming up, a long-forgotten, bloody battle closer to home.
When the South Gate is under the control of the legionary, all the city was lost.
And how the Romans imposed their will in the lands they conquered. By the 1st century CE, Rome was master of the Mediterranean, with an empire that continued to expand, but not without fierce resistance. In Iberia, modern-day Spain, tribes in the northern mountains had seen the cursed Romans swallow up much of their peninsula. So dogged and determined were they in their defence that Emperor Augustus himself left Rome to come and command his troops. So what was it that made those tribes so difficult to defeat? In the southern foothills of the Cantabrian Mountains in Spain, rising more than 1,000 metres above the plains, Mount Bonorio. Its flat summit is surrounded by these mysterious rings. When archaeologists began to investigate, they made an astonishing discovery. A fortified Iron Age city, or oppidum, that prospered for centuries before it mysteriously vanished. But that's not all. Scattered around the site, archaeologists found evidence of a violent conflict.
You can see there this projectile. This is a bullet from a ballista. It's a kind of catapult that using this kind of stone balls that was working like a bullet, actually. This is part of a pilum. The pilum is the spear of the Roman legionary.
Archaeologists now had the opportunity to investigate how the Romans dealt with stubborn resistance from a fierce rebel tribe, the Cantabri.
The Cantabrians posed a major problem for the Romans because of their style of warfare. Most of Cantabria is very, very heavily afforested, very, very steep hills, and it lends itself to guerrilla warfare. And that's what the Cantabrians did.
For 200 years, they had successfully resisted a Roman takeover. But as Rome's first emperor and Julius Caesar's adopted heir, Caesar Augustus had something to prove. So he committed 8 legions to finally crush this resistance. According to written accounts, after 10 years of fierce fighting, a great battle was fought under the walls of the city of Begida. But its location is a mystery.
Nobody knows nothing about this war until 20 years before. Then in the last 20 years, we are searching a lot, digging a lot of many different places, and all this information of this knowledge is completely new.
The Cantabri lived in hill forts throughout these mountains, but few were as large as this one. Could this be the ancient lost city of Begida, the legendary final stronghold of the Cantabri?
This is the north face of Monte Bonorio Oppidum, and when you stay here, you understand why this center is so important. This is the main pass through the center of the mountains. Then when you stay here, you control all the passes through the mountains. You control everything.
The people living here were the guardians of a mountain pass. It lay on a major route linking the central Spanish plateau to the Cantabrian Sea. Capturing this city would allow the Romans to dominate the surrounding area. But how did the fierce Cantabrian warriors plan to defend it? Archaeologists thought the mysterious rings surrounding the settlement could provide the answer.
We are in the defensive system of the fortified city. This defensive system is very sophisticated and built on a ring of defenses all around the city. Is one of the more sophisticated defensive construction in the Iron Age of the north of Spain.
We don't know if these are the walls written about in ancient texts, but no other Iron Age fort has been found in Europe with defences to rival these. Archaeologists were intrigued to find out how these huge walls were built.
The people in the Iron Age take thousands of wagons with clay from the valley to this part of the mountain for make this incredible transformation of the mountain.
A massive undertaking. But was it enough to protect their city from the Romans? On the day of battle, the Cantabrian warriors bravely came out from behind the defences to face the Romans in a pitched battle.
The Roman armies set up to fight pitched battles, and at close quarters, the average Roman legionary has so much more equipment and it's so much better than that of his opponent. And that must have been a frightening psychological thing to start with.
The battle is all day long, but finally the Romans destroyed the Cantabria, and the survivors came into the city through the defensive system.
Taking refuge behind their huge defences, they rained down arrows and spears in a last-ditch attempt to repel the Romans. But it wasn't enough.
The Romans give a big fire of arrowheads, of stone bullets from the bases of the mountain. And when the south gate is under the control of the legionary, all the city was lost.
The Romans slaughtered or enslaved the survivors, and then dealt with the settlement itself.
When we dig in Monte Bernorio, we can find this stratus of ashes covering all the city.
Evidence of a fire that proved the pulverizing force of the Roman bombardment had finally overwhelmed the last stronghold of the Cantabria. And 3 miles away from Mount Bernorio, archaeologists found clues about how the Romans consolidated their conquest of Spain.
Huerta Verona is a really big complex of constructions. We have a georadar of all the surface in this big surface, and the georadar show us a big area full of different kind of constructions, a little streets, and some different areas for different uses.
Intrigued, they began to excavate. What they found was not another Cantabrian site, but a Roman centre that was built soon after the Iron Age town was destroyed. To extinguish hopes of a Cantabrian recovery, the Romans stamped out their culture and replaced it with their own.
Imagine the indigenous people, the Cantabria people living in Huerta Verona, that every day can see this, and this is the symbolic expression of the conquest and the destruction of the Cantabria culture, the last autonomous Celtic culture in the continental Europe.
Coming up, the imperial city is attacked from within.
This was one of the biggest conflagrations that they had. It was catastrophic.
And the epic battle that forged a superpower. Ancient Rome was cursed by frequent fires. Its narrow streets and blocks of houses created the perfect conditions for fire to take hold and spread. It was during the reign of the Emperor Nero that the city suffered its worst disaster, as it was engulfed by a legendary conflagration. Rome is under attack by an enemy from within. Fire. Strong winds fan the flames. Thousands flee their homes. Hundreds die. When the fire is finally brought under control, 9 days later, 2/3 of the city have been destroyed.
This was one of the biggest conflagrations that they had. It devastated Rome at the time, but also how that was remembered. It became the fire of Rome in later memory.
But fire wasn't Rome's only internal threat. Before the smoke had even cleared, a rumour swept the city that the culprit was none other than the emperor himself, Nero.
The people of Rome, as you would expect, wanted to find someone to blame.
But were the rumours true or baseless slander? History has not been kind to Nero. Contemporary Roman historians painted him as a murderous, debauched tyrant, and this portrait has endured.
Nero's been accused of doing a lot of horrible, nasty things, and to give you the full list, I'd be here for some time. Apart from killing his mother, he kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death. He married 2 of his freedmen, taking the role of bride, and had one of them castrated. He nearly bankrupted the Roman Empire by debasing the coinage. I mean, it's quite a long list of bad things.
But today, people remember the disgraced Roman emperor for one thing in particular.
So there's a very famous anecdote in popular culture that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Actually, Nero, the ancient version of that is Nero played the cithara, the lyre, while Rome burned.
So the image is of an emperor who just doesn't care. An emperor who is so oblivious to human suffering and so in love with his own image that this firing of Rome becomes a stage set for him and a great backdrop for his performance.
Could it be true? Could the emperor really have torched his own capital city? In the aftermath of the fire, Nero came up with a plan to rebuild Rome, including a new palace for himself.
He takes the opportunity to build a huge palace in Rome, known now as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. And he is, on the one hand, rebuilding the palace that burnt down, the Domus Transitoria, but also he does it on a scale that hasn't really been seen before in Rome.
The Domus Aurea was 2.6 square kilometres of opulent palaces, temples and parks. At its heart, a 36-metre-high gilded statue of Nero himself. Annexing the land to build this golden house made Nero some powerful enemies.
Nero's Golden House was built across a swathe of land in the city centre, including properties that had previously been in the hands of senatorial families up on the Esquiline Hill. This was obviously wildly unpopular, and it was one of the things that really turned the Senate against him.
Creating the Domus Aurea might have been an ego trip, but what if Nero meant to share it?
What historians now think, and is coming through much more from the archaeological evidence, is that big parts of the palace, as we understand it, were open for the public. So think of big outdoor spaces, gardens and such things that were there for public use.
And as Nero rebuilt the city after the fire, it seemed he could do nothing right.
Things needed to be done in order to make sure that such a big fire doesn't happen again. So one of the things he does is tries to swap out building materials to the extent possible for non-flammable ones, so wood to stone. He also widens streets. So he's criticised for this because it means there's less shade. So imagine Rome in the summertime, narrow streets, more shade. However, it does help with being able to stop buildings, the fire jumping from one building to the next in quite the same way.
Despite his efforts, the damage was done. The Great Fire of Rome was a disaster for the city, but ultimately also a disaster for Nero.
the end was very quick, and for Nero it seems fairly unexpected.
4 years after the fire, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. He was to be stripped and flogged to death in public. Instead, he took matters into his own hands.
He has to, in the cover of night, go to his freedman Phaon's villa on the outskirts of Rome, and it's there that then he has another of his freedmen help him to commit suicide.
The Emperor Nero had ruled over an empire which stretched from the Middle East and North Africa to the most northerly province, Britannia, where he'd overseen the defeat of the rebel queen, Boudica, and the pacification of most of the island. But his rule revealed the dangers of leaving one man in control of a vast empire. It was the decadence and misrule of leaders like Nero that would contribute to the empire's decline. But before the time of emperors, there was one conquest that set the blueprint for Rome's method of control and paved the way for her meteoric rise, when she was one of 2 great Mediterranean superpowers. The other was Carthage. The Carthaginian Empire predated that of Rome, and it had become the biggest, the most powerful, the most prosperous empire in the Mediterranean, with a vast navy that controlled trade across that sea. But as Rome's might grew, a clash between these 2 empires became inevitable. The city of Tunis lies in a strategic position on Africa's north coast, guarding the narrow strait between the eastern and western Mediterranean. Overlooking the sea in the city's suburbs lie the ruins of an ancient metropolis that was once at the heart of Rome's wealthy African province, Carthage. But these ruins hide the remains of Rome's greatest ever rival, and evidence of one of the most decisive battles in ancient history, the Siege of Carthage. Rome is said to have razed the city to the ground and annihilated its people. But what did they really do to Carthage, and why? These 2 great powers had already clashed twice in the First and Second Punic Wars, famous for Hannibal marching his elephants through the Alps and rampaging around Italy for 15 years. Hannibal inflicted one of the worst military defeats on Rome at the Battle of Cannae in August 216 BCE. But miraculously, Rome not only recovered, but took the fight to Carthage and defeated them, and then imposed heavy penalties.
Carthage had to surrender the entire military fleet, had to give hostages to Rome, had to give up all the external territories outside of North Africa, and had to pay a huge indemnity of war, something in the range of 269,000 kilograms of silver.
They'd inflicted what they thought was a punitive fine on the city after the Second Punic War. The Carthaginians offered to pay this off really quite quickly. And the Romans were somewhat alarmed, actually, at the rise of Carthaginian wealth again. There was some concern among some of the political class in Rome about the fact that this economic flourishing might then lead again into Carthage trying to reestablish also herself as a military power.
Rome had to eliminate this threat once and for all. For the 3rd time, she went to war with Carthage. First, they would have to break through the city's legendary defensive walls, some 10 meters high and wide enough to stable elephants. So how would the Romans bring them down? They tried artillery and massive battering rams, but the walls stood firm for 2 years. And then a new commander arrived to take control. Scipio Aemilianus. the adopted grandson of the former conqueror of Carthage, Scipio Africanus.
One of the things Scipio does is to build a seawall to block the opening of the harbors so that the Carthaginians cannot go out to get supplies.
But they built a channel from the harbour out to sea.
They brought their ships out, but instead of immediately attacking the Romans, they just sort of paraded their ships around.
It was a complete surprise, and the Roman fleet was unattended. So the Carthaginians could have, attacked and really get ownership of all the Roman warships, and that would have turned the table considerably.
Instead, they gave the Romans time to gather their own ships and force a retreat, with the loss of much of the Carthaginian fleet. Then the Romans attacked the defensive walls where they were vulnerable, in the harbour.
That's where Scipio sees the weak point, and that's where he makes his final breakthrough.
Roman legionaries poured into the streets of the city and showed no mercy to their enemies.
The siege of Carthage is ended by very hard street-to-street fighting, toiling up the Bursa Hill. The thing that wins the siege at the end of the day is not a clever big thing, it is simply the Roman gladius.
As the remaining Carthaginians fought to the death, their commander, Hasdrubal Barca, grandson of Hannibal, betrayed them and surrendered.
The rest of them do not. Hasdrubal's wife does not, and indeed stands on the temple and denounces the cowardice. She calls him the most effeminate of men. As the temple is set on fire, she then slits her children's throats and then flings herself into the fire as well.
The greatest obstacle to Rome's expansion was neutralised, a civilization and its culture virtually destroyed.
It sent an important signal to other states' polities that were still in existence, that at that point Rome was really the only force to reckon with.
Rome was one of the most successful empires in the history of the world, lasting 500 years. At the height of its powers, it must have seemed indestructible. But like other empires that had gone before, it too would succumb to the curse of the ancients, to disaster and destruction, as it finally fell to the barbarians. Next time on Curse of the Ancients, the end of the world's greatest empire.
We can see destruction everywhere.
An entire community hacked to death by rivals, and a city on the rise is ravaged by a terrible plague.
All of the evacuation and abandonment led to the complete collapse.
Up now, witness the truth behind the archaeological discovery that many thought should have stayed buried in ancient Egypt's darkest hour. Or over on SBS World Movies, Elizabeth Moss stars in The Square.